Hello, everybody. From the Loyal Jones Appalachian Center at Berea College, this is Head of the Holler. I want to thank you for tuning in today, and I'm really pleased to have as our guest Kentucky author Erik Reece, who has a new book out called An American Gospel. And Erik, it's really a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks. It's always great to be in Berea.
So, Erik, you really put yourself out here in this book. It's a real personal journey of your own identity and family and history and belief and maybe unbelief. Tell us a little bit more about your childhood and growing up, and your grandfather figures prominently in this book.
Yeah, my grandfather was a country preacher in the Tidewater area of Virginia, and my father was a preacher as well in that area, and so I was heavily influenced by that. I would spend long summers with my grandparents, and I would just spend hours in the church while he was working on sermons. I would follow the maid around and play in the baptistry, and so the church had a very profound influence on me. And I just always assumed that I would be a preacher because they were preachers, and I just assumed that's what I was supposed to do. And then my father committed suicide when I was a kid, and my mom soon remarried, and we moved to Kentucky. And I would still spend summers in Virginia with my grandparents, but I wasn't living there anymore. And so as the older I got, the more I sort of began to sort of question my grandfather's really rigid, dogmatic form of Christianity. And this caused some stress for me because I love my grandfather, and I didn't want there to be this divide between us, but I knew that there were just things he thought that I no longer thought. He had a very literalist understanding of the Bible, and I was beginning to question that. And so the book is about me trying to come to terms with that, trying to find a version of Christianity that I could accept on my own. And also trying to come to terms with my father's death, and trying to come to terms with what I see as, in some ways, the suicidal direction this country is going in terms of its environmental thinking. And so there's a sort of a parallel narrative that functions there. And it goes up to the end, and ultimately I ask the question that E.O. Wilson asks: are we suicidal, as a country, in the way we consume and use electricity, and so it's a way of trying to think through both my own personal history and our country's history at the same time. So it's wildly ambitious, but
it works.
Well, thank you.
It really works. I mean, it's a big book, and I'm awed as a historian by your use of history and your understanding and grasp of history, and it's really quite impressive.
Well, I was really struck by what a duality there was from the very beginning of our history between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, and that Jefferson wanted us to be a country that was decentralized and agrarian, and Hamilton wanted a very centralized economy that was mercantile. And of course, Washington ultimately leaned in Hamilton's direction, and that's the country we've inherited. And you can look back at the financial crisis of 2 years ago and say, that's we inherited that from Hamilton. From the very beginning, Hamilton and his New York banker friends were speculating on paper money paid to the Continental Army. And so, when I started, I'm not a historian, but when I started looking back at that history, I was really fascinated by it. And my fascination was that, what if we had inherited Jefferson's vision of the country? What would it have looked like? There's a passage in his book, notes on the state of Virginia where he says the farmer is the true man of God, uncorruptible. And so Jefferson very early on saw that there was this moral vision to the agrarian vision for the country. And so, I wrote about this, and my editor said, you can't just say, let's reject Alexander Hamilton and let's embrace Thomas Jefferson. And I was like, well, yeah, that's true, but in a way, we do need to do that because we use 5 times as many resources as is sustainable in this country. And we really do need to start thinking in these Jeffersonian terms, because we're really at a crisis point in terms of climate change and peak oil and peak coal and overfishing. So those were some of the things I was trying to think through on the historical, cultural level.
It's really an American studies book, it seems to me, as I hear you describe it. And the Jeffersonian ideal may have been beaten, but it's never disappeared. And you're the latest kind of look at how that Jeffersonian dream has never quite disappeared from our culture.
Well, that's the nicest thing somebody said to me so far today.
Well,
but,
it's still,
I think
it's
you're
still
right.
early, though.
Yeah, you're right. Because it did. It moved up through Whitman
Right.
and Thoreau, and there's that
Painters, artists.
Mm-hmm. It's such a vital kind of writing in our culture. This writing about the natural world. I don't know of any country that has that rich of a tradition. If just up through Wendell Berry and E.O. Wilson,
Even Richard Brautigan, Trout Fishing in America, which I read in college.
And Rachel Carson has her
Rachel
own
Carson.
room in the Smithsonian. I mean, that book, Silent Spring, changed the world.
Right.
I know.
Well, why don't you read a passage
Okay.
for us?
Well, since I was talking about that, maybe this will connect into that. In the summer of 1890, the world's most famous author, Leo Tolstoy, was reading an essay by a writer the world hardly knew. "The rich man," wrote Henry David Thoreau, "is always sold to the institutions which make him rich." Surrounded by governesses and chambermaids, Tolstoy felt the full sting of that rebuke and found himself wishing he could be as free and unbeholden as the American loner. That same summer, Tolstoy also read, quote, "a little book by a very original and courageous poet named Walt Whitman." That little book would have been the first edition of Leaves of Grass. Inspired by those two free spirits, Tolstoy began writing a long essay about a third, a Mediterranean wanderer known as Yeshua, who we today call Jesus. "And the kingdom of God is within you," Tolstoy argued that one cannot believe in both the Sermon on the Mount and the Nicene Creed. And I go on to talk about how that Tolstoy felt that there had to be, you had to make a decision between this version of Christianity that was all about getting to heaven and this version of Christianity that was all about putting in place the moral teachings of Jesus, in this world. And when I was living in Virginia, I discovered that actually Thomas Jefferson had done this. He had taken a Bible and cut out all the miracles and pasted what was left together into this book he called The Philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. And he did, exactly what Tolstoy had proposed, to take the teachings of the Gospels and to apply them to his life. And so I found that very fascinating. And I began doing more reading along those lines, and I discovered this Gnostic gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. And strangely, that gospel looks very much like Thomas Jefferson's gospel, because it's one of the sayings is, the kingdom of God is within you and without you. And so it's this charge almost to see sort of a sense of divinity manifest both within, but also in the natural world. And if we thought that way about the natural world, then we would obviously have very different environmental policies. And so this really fascinated me that two people named Thomas had put together these two gospels that look very similar to each other. And I sort of put forward this hypothesis that the reason the people who found and translated the Gospel of Thomas were all American, all of them were American New Testament scholars, was because Thomas Jefferson's Gospel had prepared them to see this. Yeah, that's probably not true, but that was sort of, that was just kind of a whimsical notion I had.
And it makes it a much larger story than just an American duality in its own culture, it seems to me. It makes it a much more human story with the two Thomases and, moving outside these tendencies and beliefs much farther outside American culture. Erik, I want to ask you, what is it about the kind of Hamiltonian vision plus the kind of predominant view of Christianity that you ultimately are critical of? What is it about those two combined that prevent us seeing the natural world as part of the kingdom of God? What is it?
Well, I mean, they kind of dovetail nicely because if you live in a Hamiltonian world of industrial capitalism and you've polluted all the air and the water, as we're doing right now, then you really do need to be saved from this world. You need to get to a better world.
And the other
because
worldly
you trashed
view is
this
nice.
one,
Yeah.
right? Whereas if you live by a Jeffersonian model of stewardship and sustainability, you could think of this world as the kingdom of God because you would be treating it that way. You would be treating it with reverence. And so I think those are very profoundly different ways of thinking about religion in the natural world. And my argument in the book is that we've lived by this Hamiltonian model, up to this point, and now we have an environmental crisis, we have a financial crisis, and the thing that I think will best get us out of that is to begin this shift into this Jeffersonian vision. And I don't mean in the sense that we all need to move back to farms, but we need to think about how we redesign cities and redesign buildings and rethink the way we eat and live and travel in ways that are in the Jeffersonian vein. I mean, look, the mayor of Detroit is proposing, just tearing down huge blighted blocks and putting in green spaces and gardens and parks. And so, I mean, there's ways to do this, and there's a lot of cities that are doing it in very interesting ways of embracing this kind of Jeffersonian future. And, I think it's always been part of American culture, as you say. This, I call it a subversive spirit. It's never been the mainstream, but it's always been there.
Underground in some ways, isn't it?
And it keeps popping up as like in Rachel Carson, and then it goes back under. And
And given the crises today, you can't write the definitive history. You can't say that Jeffersonian vision is done, because it might, in fact, come back and be more relevant, far more relevant than ever.
Yeah.
And I suppose what you're saying is that this predominant view of Christianity, of which you are critical in your own life, becomes a rationale for treating the natural world in the way that we do. And that, too, you suggest has to change.
I mean, my grandfather never ever preached about the environment of the natural world. I don't think it ever occurred to him. And yet, he had a very strong feeling for it. He took me canoeing all the time. But he still lived with this dualism that the world is a fallen place. Even if it seems beautiful, it's still a fallen place that we need to be saved from. And so, if you want to get past that, you ultimately have to say, well, it's not a fallen place. It's an emanation of the Creator. That's a difficult shift for Christians to make, I think, but I don't think it's an impossible one. I think a lot of people have started thinking that way.
So, Erik, you describe your grandfather and you describe Thomas Jefferson, you describe the writer of the Gospel of Thomas. What would these folks think if they were to come back? And in some ways, I'm thinking about your grandfather reading your book. In other ways, I'm thinking about Thomas Jefferson, looking around us today. What are some of those implications?
I think Thomas Jefferson would like Berea.
Well, we'd like to hope so.
I think it's a model of the kind of ward, the kind of agrarian ward that he approved of. I think he would be horrified by Nicholasville Road in Lexington, where I live, which is just terrible disposable architecture and unsustainable traffic and that sort of thing. And Jefferson saw this from the beginning. He knew he was being idealistic when he was proposing these visions, but he just could not stand Hamilton. He thought it was a bad idea to let bankers have that much control. He called them the stock jobbing herd. And so, in some ways he would say, I told you so, I guess. I saw this coming.
And your grandfather?
I don't think, I think it would be hard for my grandfather and I to reconcile our versions of Christianity, because so much of the main point of his Christianity was being saved and getting to heaven and escaping this veil of tears. And so much of my version is, seeing the natural world as an emanation of the Creator. In some ways, not even making a distinction between the Creator and the creation. The philosopher Spinoza would always use the phrase God or nature, which is an interesting and profound, I think, way to think about the natural world as this emanation of the Creator. And that's the way I've chosen to think about it. And I don't think my grandfather would approve of that. I had this strange dream one time where we were having this argument about this. And I said, this is what I believe. And he said, well, prove that it's true. And in my dream, I levitated.
Wow.
So I don't know what that means.
What's up with that?
Yeah.
That might need further analysis.
I think it does, yeah.
So is there another passage that you might share with us?
Is there a part you'd like me to read from?
Maybe page 114.
Okay. I was living out at this great place called Furnace Mountain. It's a Buddhist retreat, and I was meditating in the mornings with the monks there, and the Zen master's name was Degak, and I had tried to ask. I wasn't trying to become a Buddhist, but I was asking him some questions about Buddhism and what I should be doing, and what the ultimate goal of Buddhism was. And he said it's just presence. He said, just try to find presence. To be present in the present, fully attentive, amorously. That was Whitman's way as well. And his friend Thoreau wrote that to live in such a way was to live by, quote, a newer testament, the gospel according to the moment, unquote. Such a new gospel replaces the linear Christian notion of history, which began with Adam and Eve and ends on the day of judgment, with a cyclical understanding, measured instead by changing seasons and cycles of life. Whitman called into doubt the eschatological belief in the last days, an apocalyptic end, followed by eternal damnation and salvation. Why should I wish to see God better than this day, he asks. I see something of God each hour of the 24, and each moment then. In the faces of men and women I see God, and in my own face in the glass. I find letters from God dropped in the street, and every one is signed by God's name. And I leave them where they are, for I know that others will punctually come forever and ever. Yeah.
This book it's about you, but it's larger than that. It's about Christianity, but I think ultimately it's larger than that as well. And I think that passage for me argues to that effect, that there's a larger story here. It's about American culture. It's
Yeah.
about world religions and their quest.
Yeah.
Um,
Whitman became very, very important to me in this because, Whitman, he saw an American populated by our better selves. He saw a really healthy kind of religion, what William James called the religion of healthy mindedness. And James opposed this to what he called the sick soul, which I think my father suffered from. And so I was real inspired reading Song of Myself and sort of trying to. I've always thought of literature as a way to sort of help me solve problems. It's always been a very pragmatic thing for me. It's not just a scholarly endeavor. It's always been a personal endeavor.
it's the way I see history, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Wendell Berry, I imagine, has had an influence on you as well.
Yeah, he has. For a long time, the influence was just me reading his work. And then when I got involved with the mountaintop removal stuff, I met Wendell and began working with him and watching him. And I think he's a perfect role model for a writer. I don't know any writer with more humility than Wendell has. And I don't know a writer who takes more responsibility for the place where he lives than Wendell does. And I've just really, that's really been an important thing for me to see, to sort of have a mentor like that and to realize that being a writer is not about ego, it's about engagement. And so I've really, that's been very helpful for me.
And Erik, on the surface, your first book, Lost Mountain and American Gospel, might seem disconnected, but reading them both, I really see them as quite connected. Might you be able to talk about that, some of those connections?
When I was writing the conclusion of Lost Mountain, I was trying to understand, why it is that we Americans are willing to blow the tops off of mountains. And I was trying to find a rationale for that. And I looked, back to the Puritans and to the idea of the city on the hill, and this idea that everything else was this howling, dark, savage wilderness, and that Christianity always had to separate itself from the natural world. And so I think that impulse really does go back to the Puritans. It goes back to a very dualistic thinking, that we're over here and the world's over there, and there's no sort of connection between the two. So I began to understand it as a religious problem. It goes back to the book of Genesis and the idea that we have dominion over the world. The coal companies always quote that line from Genesis. They say, accidents are devastating things like the sludge spill in Martin County are acts of God. So they'll co-opt this religious language when it's in their interest to do so. And when people from our side try to use religious language, they'll say, oh, well, can't we just keep religion out of this? But they'll use it as well. And so, I was trying to find a way to think about religion in a more sustainable sort of way. And so when I discovered the Gospel of Thomas, I thought, this is an ecological gospel. This is really a gospel
For our time.
Yeah. And so that really fascinated me. And so I said to my editor, Sean McDonald at the time, I really think American Gospel will be like a sequel to Lost Mountain. And he said, well, yeah, let's not call it that, but I can see what you mean. And so mountaintop removal sort of pops up in American Gospel, as an example of this kind of one kind of dualistic religion where, like we said, you need salvation from a world you've destroyed, as opposed to the Jeffersonian kind of stewardship.
So, Erik, I have just a few seconds left, but I want to make sure we know what your next project is.
The biggest seam of coal that has not been mined in eastern Kentucky right now sits under a place called Robinson Forest, which is the largest, most biologically diverse stretch of land east of the Mississippi River. And my employer, the University of Kentucky, owns it. So me and my colleague, Jim Krupa from biology, are combining to write a book about Robinson Forest. He's going to do the natural history. I'm going to do the personal, cultural, and political history. And we want to do for it what Wendell did for the Red River Gorge with his book Unforeseen Wilderness, write a book about, why we need to preserve this particular place. So that's what I'll be doing for the next year.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to read it, and it's been really a pleasure and an honor to have you today on Heather Holler.
Thanks for
Thank you
having me.
for all that you've done for this Commonwealth and its natural lands, Erik.
Well, thank you for sitting in the governor's office for 3 days and nights.
Well, thank you. And from all of us at Head of the Holler, we really appreciate you for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. We'll leave you, as always, with some clips from our Berea College Bluegrass Band. Thank you very much.